That was easily the most bizarre visitor I have seen. I have spent many years at this quiet conservatory. My primary purpose is to observe the wildlife, but my secondary purpose is to monitor other sentients that come to visit the lush jungle moon. Eons ago, my people ravaged our planet's natural resources and drove much of the wildlife to extinction. But as we began to journey among the stars, we found that Axinas, the larger of our two moons, was capable of harbouring life. Thanks to a few selfless individuals who had hoarded preserved samples, DNA and observational data on our wildlife, we were able to recreate a portion of our original biosphere on Axinas. Since then, we have perfected our terraforming efforts, recreating all of the conditions of our homeworld, even injecting millions of tons of molten iron into the core to increase the natural gravitational pull to within a millionth of a percent of that of our homeworld, all while pushing the moon further out to minimize the impact of the changes on the moon itself. We even reshaped the terrain to mimic that of the world before civilization. Now, we have a perfect garden, wholly natural. It is common practice to visit for my people, to commune with the wildlife and environment of our ancestors. Though nothing of the original remains, this small haven is enough for us. It is sacred to our people, but our ancestors did not believe in something as petty as ownership. We only intervene to preserve the balance. Matter-energy conversion beams precise enough to target specific molecules prevent contamination by bodily fluids, hair, skin, and waste. Anything taken into the sanctum is removed, by the visitors or by our systems. Visits must be scheduled, routes registered, and participants thoroughly vetted to prevent poaching or harm to the delicate balance of the garden world. This latest visitor, however, is quite strange. Most traverse the wilds with quiet awe, avoiding the wildlife. Many are researchers, xenobiologists, and the like. This man, Steve, was also a conservationalist. Based on my research during his vetting process, his meaning is not unlike our usage of the term. However, I found it strange that he was away from his ecosystem. His vetting process, that was vexing as well. The humans were new to the Federation, so little prior to their acceptance was documented. The humans themselves had plenty of their own documentation that they merged with the galactic databases, but it wasn't as thorough as ours, and barely met the minimum requirements. Even by human standards, though, this man had little in the way of records. Aside from his birth, the only files he had on record were medical in nature, often grave, sometimes even life-threatening, and almost always caused by some form of wildlife. Based on that alone, I would have denied him entry, but the third entry, chronologically, changed my mind. I am nothing if not thorough, so even though I had made up my mind by the second of these medical records, I persevered. I wanted my case for denial to be beyond reproach. His petition had been handed to me by the office of our Ambassador General, after all. I would have read the whole thing either way, but the Ambassador General wouldn't accept a simple no. That third record changed my mind. Gunshot wound to abdomen. I double-checked to make sure. My suspicions were confirmed. He was injured with a projectile weapon. As I continued to peruse the records searching for specific citations I could use in his case of denial, the terse report written by the local authorities was what actually changed my mind. While in the wilderness observing a herd of elephants, Mr. Irwin discovered a group of likely poachers stalking the herd. He confronted them and insisted they leave. He was shot during the ensuing altercation. He was evacuated by helicopter to trauma centre in Gaborone. I was confused. If he was a legitimate conservationalist, then why the dozens of interests from wildlife? That was answered quickly. As I remotely observed Steve, he didn't seem all that odd at first, aside from his habit of speaking to the camera drone he brought with him, as if he were addressing a friend or audience. Sensors indicated that he was not, in fact, broadcasting anything, and the drone recorded everything. Even his boring hikes through the wilderness, when he made and broke camp. Everything. It was his first interaction with the local fauna, a crewkin, that would set the tone for his entire visit. They revealed why he had so many injuries. It also made me wonder what kind of monsters live on that man's homeworld. Crewkins are predatory creatures. They hunt by stalking their prey, by skulking from tree to tree. When the time is right, they drop down on their prey, latch on with their hind limbs, pin down their arms with their lower forelimbs, and strangle them with their upper forelimbs. One crewkin, a juvenile male based on his downy fur, was stalking Steve through the trees as the human admired the many colourful flowers and fruits endemic to the tropical valley. Based on his behaviour and a few of his comments, Steve knew about the crewkin, even surreptitiously commanding his drone to glance up at the creature from time to time. Eventually, as he stood on his hands and knees next to a bush that can only be found in that particular valley, and spoke into the camera drone about it, the crewkin dropped from the tree and latched onto the human, wrapping his short, strong arms around his neck. However, rather than panicking, as most do, Steve greeted it and continued to address the camera. He then sat back calmly in what I assume was a more comfortable position. "Crikey!" Steve exclaimed, accurately describing the texture of the fur, the behaviour, hunting methods, and other interesting tidbits of information about crewkins, as he struggled in vain to close the human's windpipe. Other than a slight increase in the pitch of his voice, the human seemed largely unaffected by the crewkin's attempts to kill him. He then began to do something I had never, in all my life, seen a sentient do. He began to pet it. Its arms, head, neck, and eventually its chin. Due to the curvature of their arms and claws, the chin is a hard-to-reach spot for them, and you will often see crewkins rubbing their chins on each other or on trees to scratch them. It's something they thoroughly enjoy. This juvenile was no exception. As its grip around Steve's neck, torso and arms began to slacken, Steve gently but firmly lifted the beast over his head, turned it around and then lowered it into his lap. After a little fidgeting, he figured out the position in which crewkin mothers carry their young before they are strong enough to traverse the trees on their own, all while petting it and addressing it in soothing tones. Eventually, the crewkin's instincts kicked in, and it latched onto him, nuzzling into the human's chest and cooing. All the while, Steve was listing off all the most interesting features of the crewkin, occasionally addressing the crewkin itself. Finally, when he had given a rather thorough lecture on the crewkin to his drone, he gently pried the creature off of him, placed it on the trunk of a nearby tree, fed it a small frog he had plucked from that tree's roots, a common treat given to infantile crewkin by their mothers while they are learning to eat solid food, and continued on his way. These bizarre interactions continued. Wild, dangerous beasts, the kind you give a wide berth, would cuddle or lounge with him, as he talked about them in calm, quiet tones at his drone. I quickly understood how he had acquired all those interests. This man had no fear, only love. It warmed both of my hearts to see this kind of conservationalist, fearless in his love of nature, willing to risk life and limb to interact with them, yet always managing to do so on their own terms. He spoke to them, not just with words, but with his body language, demeanour and tone. They all instinctively came to understand that he was no threat, only a passive observer, maybe even a friend. What concerned me, though, was that in spite of his recklessness, he wrapped up his 2-week sojourn through over 1,000 kilometres of wilderness with no injuries, and definitely not for a lack of trying. Scatterclaws slipped across his skin. Tamlor fangs squirted venom harmlessly across his forearm. Kamar constrictors hung from him like tightly wrapped shawls. Even the peerless Zorg beast, who should trample or gore anything that displayed even the slightest hint of fear or threat in their presence, grazed peacefully around him. They even allowed him to play with their young. Never in all our history has anyone recorded an image of a sentient, in the same frame as a living Zorg beast infant, and yet there he was, carrying one on his shoulders as 3 more chased him around in play, the adults grazing idly in a protective circle around them. I could hardly tell the difference between his laughter and their brays of joy. When he left the herd the following day, he managed to mimic the sign of respect juniors show their seniors, by getting down on his knees and elbows with his hands tucked under his chest, while tapping his chin on the ground. The matriarch actually acknowledged the gesture, by lightly tapping the soil with one of her hooves, before the herd turned away and continued their migration. During the many boring stretches of Steve's visit, I researched him more, diving deeper into the human databases. I eventually stumbled records of his ancestors in human entertainment media. He was named after a distant patrilineal ancestor, 8 generations back, and came from a line of famed conservationalists who sought to bring attention to the wonders of nature. As he left, we began cleansing protocols, only to discover that, aside from some hair, oils and dead skin, he had left nothing behind, not even excrement or microbes. I revisited his list of equipment and found that he brought equipment specifically for that purpose, and carried all of his waste off the planet with him. He had even sterilized his skin and internal organs beforehand, knowing he'd require rather extreme medical attention upon his return. While he was recovering, I received his request to visit Axinis again. This time his route was through the remaining regions he hadn't seen in his first journey. I approved it immediately, under the condition that he visit my conservatory first.